here as promptly as you were. I think we're still waiting for a few individuals, and hopefully they'll hop on and join us as soon as they possibly can. But we do have a lot of information to get through today. So with that, Ms. Sandoval, if you would be so kind to just kind of pull up a reminder of our norms and our purpose, and we'll give everybody a chance to review those. Thank you. So we'll start with our goals at the top there, Ms. Sandoval. Thank you so much. We'll give everybody a chance to review those. And then on the same screen, you can roll your eyes down to the norms.
I like myself.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sandoval. And with that, we will get closer into the heart of our agenda today. We do want to just make one acknowledgement. We're normally joined by two trustees. Today, we are joined by Board President Diane Jones, but we are not joined by Trustee Campbell, who's a regular attendee at this committee. And that is because Trustee Campbell has been elected to the City Council of Fremont. And so she is in the immediate time right now, transitioning into that role. I believe she'll be sworn in to her council position tomorrow. And that by default will create a vacancy on our board. And for those of you who may be wondering about that process, we have that on our agenda for Wednesday night's board meeting. And there's some comprehensive information presented there. For those of you who have maybe seen this happen before during your time in Fremont or other districts, what happens when a trustee either resigns, stops serving, or is elected to another position, which ultimately requires them to resign because they can't hold both positions at once. The Board of Education is then faced with a decision to make, and they must either hold a special election, which we pay for out of the general fund, or they make a provisional appointment. And so that will be the item that is before the board to consider on Wednesday night. In terms of Trustee Campbell's participation in this committee, so that our members here are informed, or this task force, the board generally at the organization meeting, which is Wednesday night, will decide what committees each trustee will serve on for the next year. In light of the pending vacancy on our board, we are going to be moving the committee assignments for our trustees to our February board retreat, because by that time we anticipate that if the board moves to a provisional appointment, that process will be completed. The reason we anticipate it will be completed is because if the board does make that decision, they have 60 days in order to complete that process under the Ed Code and board policy. So it's a relatively rapid turnaround. And that gives the board, as well as whoever may be the provisional appointee, if that's the decision of the board, the opportunity to review all the task forces and committees in participation. So with that, our main item today is our first interim budget report. And as you all likely know, it's our first snapshot and kind of official progress report on where we are in the moment versus the budget that we adopted. I will give you kind of a brief overview of what we are hearing at the state level in terms of the fiscal picture, which I want to be clear is not necessarily a direct connection to our first interim. Remember, as I mentioned earlier, our first interim is a progress report compared to the budget we adopted in June. But as we look forward to the governor's January budget proposal, what we're hearing at the state level right now is obviously a slowdown in the economy is having an effect on all state revenues. Right now, it looks like a $25 billion problem for next year for the state's budget, and about a $42 billion problem over the next 3 years. So that can be a bit alarming. The good news is, different than the last recession, and depending on which economic forecast you listen to, some will say we're in a recession, some will say we're not, we're just in a slowing down of the economy. But what is different is in the last recession from 08, that kind of snuck up on everybody, and we didn't have things in place at the state level in order to address that. Currently, the state fiscal picture looks quite different. They've established kind of a rainy day fund, and so they have a much higher level of reserve to help offset some of these things. And so what we're hearing, despite this decreased revenue, is that we aren't necessarily talking about cuts just yet at the state level. And so what does that mean for us, and what's the impact? Well, we know inflation's up. We know that when that happens, the federal government is bringing up interest rates with the intent of bringing down the inflation. But all those things combined have an impact on the stocks and the equity markets. And that's a real connection point for California because of how we fund our schools. I think we've talked about this here before. California gets a major amount of its revenue from the top 1% of the state. And a lot of that wealth that exists within the top 1% exists within stocks and equity markets. And so when inflation's up, interest is up, and the stock market is unstable, then our top 1% are much more reserved in their habits as it relates to their stocks and their equities. So that contributes a lot to us in California in particular, because of our mechanics of how the state funds our schools. The projection for COLA, which is a part that we look at very closely. So there is the statutory COLA, which you may recall, that's a formulaic number. It's not something that anybody has necessarily an influence over or a recommendation over. It's completely formula driven. Right now, the statutory COLA is right around 8.75%, according to the last information I've seen from the Legislative Analyst's Office. Now, what we are hearing from the state is with the economic slowdown, they project that they meaning the Legislative Analyst's Office projects that we can fund about 8.3% of that COLA. So remember, there's the statutory COLA that's defined by rule. And then there's the funded COLA, which is what the state provides to us as the funded amount. And you may remember in some years, in some really difficult years, we actually got a negative COLA from the state. But that statutory calculation is what we're watching. And some estimates show that it could go up to 9%. It could come down to 8.5%. I think we'll know a little bit more when we get to the governor's budget in January. And the important part is what we're hearing is that funding the COLA might be the extent of the revenue that the state has for us next year, meaning we're not going to be seeing a lot of supplemental or other dollars in the education budget, which to me makes sense because we saw such an unprecedented year of revenue this year. And so I think when we have such an unprecedented year of revenue, there's a natural course of circumstance that happens where we right size. And I think that's what's happening at the state level. But we'll keep you updated. Obviously, in one of our future meetings, we'll be looking at the governor's budget proposal, which usually comes out just around or after January 10th. And I think we'll see a lot of priorities there. Our trustees and myself and Ms. Sandoval, we just returned from the CSBA conference, the California School Boards Association conference. And what was one noteworthy takeaway is the governor's position in how the range in which he was elected in terms of the amount of votes that he received versus his competitors. And then in the recall process, he received almost the same differential. And so you have a governor who is really in a strong position from looking at the statewide election process. And then at the state level, you have a huge number of new elected state officials. And so it's going to be a really interesting back and forth that the governor and the legislature do in this budget development process. So we'll keep our eyes on all of that, and we'll hope for some good momentum in the economy still as we continue to move forward. So with that kind of overall picture of what we're looking at into the next year, I'm going to turn it over to James, our Director of Budget, Accounting, and Attendance, as well as our Associate Superintendent, Mr. Hillman, Daniel Hillman. if either of them have any introductory remarks before we move into the first interim budget report.
Thank you, Superintendent Kamick. Danny, before I start, did you have any opening remarks?
No, it's okay. Go right ahead.
Sounds good. So good evening, everyone. Good evening, Budget Advisory Task Force. Once again, James Arcala, Director of Budget Audit and Attendance. And tonight I have the privilege of presenting our 22-23 first interim budget. Next slide, please. Here's a roadmap of where we're headed tonight. First, we'll be discussing the first interim overview, and then we'll be discussing the general fund. Then we'll go into the multi-year projections, other funds, and finally, our next steps. Next slide. So just a friendly reminder, our first interim report does cover the financial and budgetary status of the district for the period ending October 31. So this is an update just for July 1 through October 31st. Next slide, please. This is our budget cycle. So we are at first interim. I just wanted to emphasize that at first interim, we are including the 45-day budget assumptions that we presented to the board back in August. So those numbers will be embedded in the first interim numbers as we go forward. Next slide, please. So starting at the 40,000 foot level, we're here to compare the combined general fund between adopted and comparing the adopted budget and first interim. And we're going to note some changes at a very high level. Then we'll drill down into the numbers as we go on into the slides. So as we focus on the variance columns all the way to the right, revenues increased due to budgeting the 45-day budget assumptions, such as LCFF increases, the 2 one-time block grants. These are some of the assumptions that we did present at the 45-day budget. And then going on to expenditures, expenditures increased mainly due to budgeting carryover after closing the books, which happened in September, and especially due to budgeting for negotiated salary increases, including the 21-22 retros and 22-23 raises. So those two increases, they all hit within this fiscal year. As a result, we have a surplus highlighted by the first green arrow at the top due to the large amount of restricted one-time dollars we received in the current year. So we did receive a lot of one-time restricted dollars within this 22-23 year, and it's reflected at first interim. And we'll just dissect that surplus in the next slides. Finally, at the bottom green arrow shows that we have an 8.3% in reserves. Next slide, please. So as we dissect the general fund and separate out the unrestricted funds only, we show deficit spending of $15.1 million highlighted by the first red arrow. Deficit spending is mainly due to budgeting for the 21-22 retros and the 22-23 raises. The bottom red arrow highlights that designations decreased by $33.3 million because we use those committed funds to budget for the raises here in the 22-23 year at first interim. The ending fund balance decreased by $18.2 million due to deficit spending and will continue to drop in the subsequent years due to ongoing deficit spending, which we will discuss later when we talk about the MYP or multi-year projections. Next slide, please. On the restricted side of the house, we see the actual surplus highlighted by the green arrow. The surplus is due to budgeting $41 million in total revenue for the 2 new one-time block grants. This influx of one-time restricted funds helps us cover that unrestricted deficit when the funds are combined. However, when we pull things apart, we do see the district is truly deficit spending. Now, contributions and expenditures increased due to budgeting for salary increases, which is emphasized by the red arrow we have here, which emphasizes that contributions increased by $6.2 million. Next slide, please. Here we have the general fund designations in the ending fund balance. So first we have the revolving cash and stores totaling to roughly $400,000. And then we go to restricted. We have $46.8 million in restricted funds there. Then we have under assigned we have our 1% reserve variance at $5.1 million. And then on an annual basis for the next 3 years, we have this math textbook adoption, which we set aside. We'll be spending those dollars for that textbook adoption every year, leaving us with a reserve of 8.3% or $42.9 million. Next slide, please. Now for the revenue assumptions for the general fund, LCFF, or the local control funding formula sources, is at $369.8 million at first interim. As a reminder, we're now using the state-approved funded ADA based on the 3-year average. Enrollment is at 32,717 based on our latest CalPEDS data, which is actually a decrease of 754 students compared to 21-22 last year. So we are declining in enrollment. As you know, enrollment and ADA, or attendance, impacts our revenue, so we must monitor the impact in the out years as we project to continue losing students. For federal revenue, we carried over CARES Act funds and ELOG funds, or Expanded Learning Opportunities Grant funds, which we are expected to be spent by next September of 2023. These funds will be discussed in more detail on the following slide. State revenues increased mainly due to budgeting the $21 million for the one-time Arts, Music, and Instructional Materials Grant, which are truly flexible dollars, and $20 million for the Learning Recovery Block Grant. For our local revenue, I did want to highlight our parcel tax, which is expiring in June 2025. We roughly receive $4.4 million annually, and that will have a large impact on our reserves in the later years as we continue deficit spend. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, here's a brief overview of the ELOG funds, and after this, the CARES Act funds. So starting with the ELOG funds, just wanted to give everyone a brief update. So at the very bottom, let's look at the bolded total at the bottom. We have $3.1 million left to spend down, and we're planning to spend those dollars down by next September. So of that $3.1 million, we'll be spending $1.3 million on paras and $1.8 million on supplemental instruction and support. Next slide, please. Here we have our ESSER funds. And so for our ESSER funds, which connects to our CARES Act funds, we have roughly $640,000 left for the year, and we do plan to spend those down by next September of 2023 as well. Next slide, please. So going into our expenditures for the general fund, salaries increased by $51.2 million due to budgeting for negotiated salary increases for last year and this year. Utilities increased by $2.3 million due to opening our 2 new schools, Lytle Bringhurst Elementary and our Ricks Early Learning Center. Finally, strictly for restricted funds only, books and supplies increased by roughly $30 million and services increased by $4 million due to budgeting carryover after we close the books. This is an annual thing that happens during first interim. After we close the books, we do budget for those carryover dollars. Next slide, please. Now, in regards to expenditures, I just wanted to highlight that at first interim, it does include the actual payments and encumbrances for September and October payrolls, which includes the FUTA and FSMA retros and increases. Now, at second interim, we're going to show the actual payments and encumbrances for the rest of the bargaining units. So we already did budget for all the salary increases based on our projections, but the actual payments and actual encumbrances will be reflected at second interim. Next slide, please. Now, here are the multi-year projections for our general fund. So deficit spending continues in the subsequent years, as you see here in red. We do, as a result of deficit spending, we have a decreasing fund balance and decreasing reserves. Reserves dropped to 7.13% and 4.72% in 23-24 and 24-25 respectively. I just wanted to note that the large influx of one-time funds that we keep speaking about, it helped boost our bottom line. And without those one-time funds, our reserves would actually drop to 6.12% and 3.22% in the subsequent years. So I just really wanted to highlight that out. Next slide, please. Now for our MYP These are the major revenue assumptions. Enrollment is projected to continue declining by approximately 500 students per year, or about 1 to 2%. For COLA, we use the school services dartboard that projects 5.38% in 23-24. But as our superintendent did explain, the LAO estimates between 8 to 9% COLA, and we'll be updating our estimates based on the governor's January budget proposal. So there is more to come on COLA, and we'll reflect that in January and at second interim. As discussed in the previous slide, we are contributing one-time dollars towards unrestricted funds in order to sustain adequate reserves in the out years. Next slide, please. Here are the key expenditure assumptions for our MYP. So we budgeted salary increases in 23-24 based on the agreed upon COLA minus 1%. We have a decrease of 10 FTE certificated staff each year due to declining enrollment. We did increase classified staff by 10 FTE in 23-24 as we open the converted middle schools and project additional TK classes. And supplies are projected to increase by 3% each year as we do expect inflation to keep going. Utilities increase by 10% each year due to rising costs such as fuel, and special ed contribution is projected to increase by $500,000 annually based on historical trends. Now, the main takeaway is that we are solvent for this year with 8.3% reserves, but we are deficit spending. We need to right-size the district based on declining enrollment as we prepare for adopted budget for 23-24. Our goal is to achieve balance. We need to balance our expenditures and revenues in order to, number one, eliminate deficit spending, number two, increase our reserves, and number three, maintain fiscal solvency. Next slide, please. Now, for all other funds, we are projected to end the year balanced without any contributions from the general fund, which is great news. And finally, next slide. We have our next steps here. So in January, we're going to hear more on the governor's 23-24 budget proposal. And then in March, we'll come back for the second interim budget report. We'll also have the audited financial statements. And then May, we'll have the governor's May revise for 23-24. And finally, we'll have our adopted budget in June. Thank you, everyone, for your time. Any questions? President Jones?
Sorry, I can't find my raise hand feature. When we talk about right-sizing the district or right-sizing the budget, is that a euphemism for budget cuts? I'm just gonna go there. Is that what we're looking at?
I think it's a good question, President Jones. I don't necessarily see it exactly the same way, in that it won't necessarily, when we look at budget cuts, obviously, as I think this group knows, with nearly 85 to 88% of our budget invested in people, when we talk about budget cuts, we're also talking oftentimes about program reductions. And so I think what we're looking at is, as we continue to get smaller, it's important that we then right-size the staffing to match. So, that's really the first place where we want to right-size the district, is making sure that our staffing projections for next year and our enrollment projections for next year are mirrored very closely. And then balancing out what staff we have. For example, as James mentioned in the presentation, and as you know from our reports to the board, we have a number of positions that are funded with one-time dollars. And so the right sizing really includes all of that. It's making sure that our positions funded with one-time dollars stay funded with the one-time dollars, and our other positions that are associated with enrollment staffing ratios, that we're adjusting those accordingly as well.
Okay, so I know in the last few years, at least, well, ever since I've been on the board, actually, we've been able to manage with just natural attrition, and it's allowed us to avoid, I'm gonna say, avoid layoffs, and I know, are we anticipating that will continue to be the case at least for the next 2 years?
I don't know about 2 years, and I think, when you, as you pointed out, President Jones, I don't think Fremont Unified School District has done an RIF, a technical reduction in force, in quite some time from everything that I can see. And that's oftentimes one of the impacts of a large district is we do hire 100 to 120, depending on the year, teachers. And that is likely because we have a few more than that are actually leaving us, whether it's through retirement, resignation, non-reelect. And I'm focused on that certificated side because I think our classified employees also know that that is something that happens year round and there's continuous and regular vacancies there. But on that certificated side and that staffing ratio, we have been able to manage it through attrition. I think we likely will this year, but I think we're coming to a point in the next few years, and it's hard to predict exactly what year it will be, where we may have to look at some actual official reductions in force, because there are going to be points in time, if our enrollment continues to decline, where some of our more specialized positions, our more singleton positions, might be what's impacted most directly by that. So I think the time will come in the near future. I don't necessarily anticipate that it's this year, but it could be in the next 2 to 3 years.
And one of the other things that I was thinking about as we talk about, enrollment projections and declining enrollment, and I was looking at the demographer's report, and there are some, significant declines, especially at some of our schools. And I know, and this may not be related, well, it is partly related to the budget. We allocate prep based on school size, and we need to think ahead, because I don't want our students missing prep because their school sizes have shrunk. So I don't know how we're gonna tackle that. I think if the enrollment decrease, and I know we're not the only ones facing it, is alarming. And I'm hoping what we can really do at the state level is really lobby our legislators to think about how they are going to help us handle declines in enrollment, because hopefully they want to help us keep schools open and utilize, I'm going to say, this opportunity to lower class sizes. And we can do that if they maintain our funding levels. We can't if our funding is continuously tied to enrollment in the way it is. And I'm hoping that we can get traction with some really strong advocacy work so that the whole state can manage these losses in a way that we can still serve our students well. I'm nervous about what's going to happen if we don't have action at the state level.
Yeah, and I think your point is well taken, and there's certainly some conversations to be had at the state level. I think we saw their first bite at that apple and giving us a 3-year rolling average, for lack of a better term. But I also think I just left a meeting in San Diego with the AXA Superintendency Council, and it's about 18 superintendents from across the state. And one of the areas that we're focused on is really the ADA for this year, the percentage, because what superintendents across the state are seeing, and we're seeing an impact of it here locally, is with COVID rates picking back up again in the last month, RSV picking up significantly again for the first time in a number of years, and the flu. There are a number of school districts across the state, ours included, who are seeing a major uptick in student absences right now. And so we are in P1 still, or P2, for our attendance reporting. And so that's going to have an impact on our ADA percentage. And I think that's where we need to continue to work, as you've described, at the state level to figure out those things. Other questions, feedback, input, concerns, desires for us to be looking at as we move forward? Michelle?
Yeah, my question is, and Superintendent Kamick, you had said that the formula that the state is looking at on COLA, that they could go 8.7, could go in from 8.5 to 9. We're all kind of looking at it. But budgeting, you have it down to, what was it, around 5.38 or something like that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Which is quite the gap there. And just wondering, I know contractually for increases, I believe it's, whatever COLA was minus 1% was for a lot of the bargaining units. But that the number that I saw Mr. Arcala had seemed to be what was projected from the bargaining, not what is being projected by the state. And it's like, why are we switching up numbers?
Yeah, that's a great question, Michelle, and I'm happy to talk about that. And I think either Danny or James can offer some comments as well. So remember that when we look at our budget adoption, those are the numbers we had in June, right? And what we use and what county offices, when we send our budgets to county office for approval, they expect us to be using a certain set of data. And so what they generally look at is, what does school services set out as their dartboard? And if you're familiar with the school services dartboard, that is kind of the benchmark for what most districts and county offices are using to build their budget projections. And you're right, in real time versus the last published dartboard, there is oftentimes a gap. And so the next dartboard that we will see is going to be, I believe, at the governor's January budget proposal. And at that point, I expect that COLA number will be closer to what the legislative analyst's office is talking about, which is about 8.75. And so when that happens, that second interim, we will take the guidance from the county and update our second interim budget report. It is important because it significantly impacts our revenue projection. And as you described, it does impact our negotiated settlements. And that's true for FUTA, SEIU, and CSEA. But what is important to note about those settlements is, irregardless of our individual projections or even the state projections, the settlements mandate that it is the state-funded COLA less 1%. So whatever the state lands at, less 1% will be our next settlement. So even if the district decided to project lower, it won't matter in relation to the settlement. But that's also part of what we saw last year with budget adoption, is we saw numbers around 5.3, 5.45, somewhere around there. And then I think that the state adopted budget, it was 6.36 or somewhere around there. So that gap in real time versus our last projection is oftentimes the case. And that's why we always try and take a look at those legislative analyst office reports, because even though the county is asking us to use the last dartboard number, we are thinking and planning for a higher number. And so it is there on paper and it doesn't make sense. That's why I think James called out in the presentation that we expect a higher number in January. Yeah, it's something that we talk about frequently, because if there's information that's already publicized about, well, the COLA is going to be much higher, then it's oftentimes a very normal and regular question of, well, why aren't we using that in our projections now? And Danny and James might have a more official term for it, but when school services puts out their dartboard, whenever we do a budget projection, the county, there's a group of, I think it's CBOs across the state from county offices. There's a select number of them that get together and they kind of come up with the framework that is what districts should use in submitting their budgets. And so we have that issue there as well. But important note there, the settlements, they're completely dependent on the state funded COLA, irregardless of our projections. Our projections can't impact that number. Anything else from the group as we look moving forward? Are there key questions that you want us to keep in mind as we look at the governor's budget proposal. I mean, I will tell you some of the things that I'm thinking about as we go into it. I want to see, are they going to be talking about any ADA enrollment funding changes? Will they be looking at any impact to the one-time dollars that we have right now spread over multiple years? There's some discussion that if things were to get worse, they might pull some of that back. We haven't heard that yet. There hasn't been conversations at the state level about current year or future year cuts. As I said earlier, really the focus is trying to fund as much of the COLA as the state can. And the other part that I'll be looking at is, you may have heard about Prop 28 passing, which is additional money for arts and music, which is a great thing. But it's also worth noting that there's some complications there. Oftentimes when you pass legislation, there is. And so what's happening right now is a lot of advocacy at the state level for what happens for those dollars. And right now, the way we understand it and the way we're being advised is that districts will receive those dollars. They will have a maintenance of effort requirement year over year, and that those dollars will also have to go directly to school sites based on a formula within Prop 28. So each school, based on their student population, will receive a certain amount of money. And so there looks to be a lot of regulations around that money, which can be good because it's intended to support music and arts, but sometimes can create complications as well. Mr. Hillman, other thoughts as we look forward to the January budget?
One thing that we'll want to keep an eye on that I know we do anyway, but especially given the economic conditions that you were mentioning earlier, Superintendent Kamick, is with the downturn in the stock market recently, we're going to want to watch the data coming from STRS and PERS, our retirement agencies at the state level. A large portion of the returns that the stock market sees affect STRS and PERS and their solvency. And so if they start to see something that looks negative for them, they will advocate at the legislature and with the governor to come up with solutions. And the last solution that they came up with was a difficult one for every school district. School districts were expected to come up with that shortfall. So we're going to want to watch that. And hopefully the stock market doesn't continue to decline over the long term while inflation starts to chill out. Hopefully we get what they're calling a soft landing. You may hear that in the news and media outlets. They're trying to get inflation to slow down calmly without taking the economy into a hard recession. And hopefully the stock market follows suit, because that will then buoy a nice return for the pension fund. So that'll be another factor we want to look at, because the state may ask school districts to foot the bill for any changes there or shortfalls in the out years. Right now, everything's stable and locked in for this year and next year. But beyond the next 2 years, it remains to be seen.
Yeah, and I think as we look at the governor's January budget, this is a little more political than fiscal, but it was discussed at some of the sessions that we were at our CSBA conference, which is, this is a really important budget proposal for the governor, because he's going to come into this budget proposal, and then there's going to be a lot of back and forth with the legislators before they adopt the budget in June. And the reason it's important for the governor is, I'm not a political expert, but there's a lot of discussion that he may be looking at a more national lens now and into the future. And if that's the case, I think he's going to be very invested politically and fiscally in what he shows as academic investment or investment in schools. So what does that impact? It impacts things like our free meal program that's being funded at the state level as well, federal support for that. The ELOP program is very important to the governor. And so a lot of the programs that were put in place, we think the governor is really going to fight to maintain and keep, because he has a political and personal interest in those. And that's why we think that most of what we'll see in the governor's budget proposal is going to be the Prop 98 dollars really dedicated to funding the COLA. And that's something that we support as well, because that goes to the base of LCFF. And when we talk about increased funding, that's really what we're always talking about, is increasing the base. And that's where the COLA money goes. So that's what we're looking for, as opposed to categorical or one-time money. So those are some of the things that we're looking for in the governor's budget proposal, and we'll bring back an update for our task force once we see that. I think, as I said earlier, it's released around January 10th, and we will go to Sacramento for a presentation and the county office for a presentation as well. Make sure we've got updated information from two separate groups. Anything else from the team?
Just really quick, I think right after the governor announces his budget, that's going to be a critical time for us to be meeting with our legislators. And it would be great to have like a united group with district staff, one or two trustees, and our bargaining group, representation from our bargaining group to meet with our legislators, especially because we have some new folks who are going to need an education into how funding really works, because too often I think our legislators have so much that they have to cover that sometimes they're not experts in every area. They have staff that help them with that, but they need our help to really understand what the impact on the ground is of the budget proposals and bills that they propose. And it'll be really critical to get their ears early in the process of them looking at the governor's budget, so that we can help them with the lens that they look at the budget proposals with, so that they can work on the changes that we're going to need to see.
Yeah, I think President Jones, you reminded me of a statistic that we heard at CSBA, and I won't remember it correctly. So other than the fact that this is being recorded, don't use it against me. But it does give context, and I'm going to use the number 10. I think that's a pretty close number. But when you think about all of the state legislators, I think there's only around 10 that were in office when LCFF was implemented. And so you think about everybody who's elected at the state level and everybody who's there now, and almost none of them were there when LCFF was implemented, which means they don't really truly understand LCFF at its core and how our funding formula works. And I think that's where President Jones is saying it will be important for us to, in many ways, help them understand what the current legislation means for school funding in the state and for their constituents here in Fremont. So there is some education that I think we can do to be helpful to our elected officials at the state level, because they might have a broad scale understanding of it, but they may not really understand it in the way that we do, living it since its implementation in what Mr. Hillman 13, 14, somewhere around there. So that's a lot of turnover at the state when you recognize how new the population of elected officials is, and that almost all of them weren't around for the creation of LCFF. So we now are the knowledge keepers of that platform, and we'll have to help pass on the origin story. All right. Well, that takes us to 4:45. I want to open for a minute for future topics. I think we likely can all agree that our primary future topic will be a review of the governor's budget proposal in January. Are there other areas of school finance or FUSD finance that the task force would like us to be looking at in the next few months? And since there's so many requests now, it's using up all the bandwidth. If you don't want to mention it now, you can always email myself, Patty, Mr. Hillman, and we'll put our heads together to build an agenda around that interest. So I appreciate everybody being here. Is there anything for the good of the order before we close? Okay, I will just note that if you're interested, at our meeting on Wednesday, we will be beginning the meeting with recognition of Trustee Campbell, if any of you are inclined to stop by in person or on Zoom and offer thanks for her decade of service to Fremont Unified. All right. Well, with that, our task force meeting is adjourned for the day. Thank you, everybody. Stay warm, stay safe, and have a wonderful holiday with your loved ones.
Thank you.